Just hours before the palace was expected to make an announcement, two familiar royal figures were seen arriving somewhere they had no obvious reason to be. Sophie and Edward entered quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. And what happened behind those closed doors may have changed the royal family forever. There was no grand entrance, no carefully managed royal appearance, no reassuring display of normality. Sophie and Edward arrived with the kind of discretion that immediately raised uncomfortable questions. Their vehicles appeared within a narrow window of one another, close enough to suggest coordination, yet separated enough to avoid turning the moment into an obvious procession. They were not behaving like royals arriving for a public duty. There was purpose in the timing, urgency in the movement, and something unmistakably private about the entire encounter. What made it more unsettling was everything that was absent. No scheduled engagement had been announced. No line of photographers waited for the familiar smiles. No ceremonial greeting softened their arrival. No visible reception suggested that this was an ordinary meeting hidden beneath royal formality. Instead, the atmosphere carried the weight of business that was never intended to become public. And the timing made that silence impossible to ignore. The palace was already expected to speak within hours. An announcement was coming, and inside royal life, announcements are rarely spontaneous. They are prepared, reviewed, timed, and protected. So why would Sophie and Edward suddenly be called in so close to the moment when the public was about to hear something important? That question became even more disturbing when attention turned to Sophie herself. She remained composed, as she so often did, but this was not the relaxed composure of ceremony. It felt controlled, deliberate, the kind of calm maintained by someone carrying information that could not yet be spoken aloud. Edward, meanwhile, appeared even more guarded. His position within the family had long depended on restraint, loyalty, and the ability to perform duty without becoming the center of the story. If he had been brought into an emergency conversation, then whatever was unfolding was unlikely to be trivial. That was when the first whisper began to take shape. Perhaps the meeting was not simply about preparing Sophie and Edward for an announcement. Perhaps it was about deciding who would stand behind that announcement once it became public. Who would accept the consequences? Who would inherit new responsibilities? And, more dangerously, who might lose influence, access, status, property, ceremonial authority, or something far more personal in the process? Because within the monarchy, emergency discussions are not called merely to exchange information. They happen when the institution believes something must be settled before uncertainty becomes conflict. Titles can carry emotional wounds. Inheritance can become a battlefield. A ceremonial role can quietly determine who is trusted and who is being left behind. And on this occasion, the tension reportedly deepened when it became clear that Sophie and Edward were not the final arrivals expected behind those doors. Someone else, or perhaps something else connected to the decision, was still on its way. And if Sophie and Edward had been summoned merely to listen, their hurried arrival would have been intriguing enough. But the next detail suggested they had been called there because the palace needed something from them. The palace has louder personalities, more famous names, and royals far closer to the center of public fascination. So why summon Sophie and Edward? The answer may lie in the quality that has kept them out of countless scandals, their extraordinary ability to know more than they ever say. Within the family, that kind of silence can become a form of power. Sophie and Edward have built their place not by dominating attention, but by surviving it. They are the pair who can enter a difficult room, hear something sensitive, and leave without turning the moment into a public spectacle. In an institution where every careless word can become a headline, that discipline makes them unusually valuable. It also makes them useful when the monarchy needs people who can absorb pressure without immediately passing it on. Sophie's position is especially complicated. She understands the public face of royal life, the careful language, the reassuring smiles, the rituals designed to make upheaval look orderly. But she also understands the private cost of those decisions. Behind every new duty is often someone losing one. Behind every graceful transfer of responsibility may be disappointment, resentment, or grief that cannot be acknowledged openly. That leaves Sophie in a dangerous middle ground, close enough to the institution to understand what must be done, yet close enough to the family to know who might be hurt by it. Edward carries a different weight. Being born into royalty does not guarantee permanent influence. He knows that roles can expand, disappear, return in another form, or be quietly reassigned when the needs of the crown change. That knowledge makes him cautious. It also makes him valuable. He understands that royal importance is never as secure as it looks, and lately, the couple's increasing visibility may have drawn them closer to the center of decision-making than many people realized. Reliability has a consequence. The more dependable someone becomes, the more likely the institution is to place difficult burdens on their shoulders. Duties others cannot perform. Responsibilities others refuse. Decisions that come with prestige in public and resentment in private. That is where the deeper tension begins. A royal role can sound ceremonial, almost harmless, while carrying access to residences, archives, patronages, heirlooms, jewels, and privileges loaded with memory. And the suggestion now surrounding this meeting was that Sophie may have been asked to accept something tied, emotionally or symbolically, to another branch of the family. To the palace, saying yes could be called service. To someone else, it could feel like replacement. That possibility changes everything, because the coming announcement may only reveal the smallest part of what was decided. The public might hear about continuity and duty. Behind closed doors, however, the real story could involve a much larger redistribution of trust, responsibility, and royal inheritance. But the most explosive question was no longer why Sophie and Edward had been called. It was what the palace was apparently preparing to place into their hands. Inside royal life, power rarely arrives with applause. Sometimes it arrives in a folder, a sealed instruction, a private conversation, or a single sentence spoken across a polished table. And according to the drama unfolding behind those doors, Sophie and Edward were being offered something far heavier than prestige. Within this dramatized royal crisis, the question was no longer whether Sophie and Edward could be trusted. That had already been decided. The question was whether they were prepared to accept a larger mandate, one connected to duties that had once belonged, formally or emotionally, to someone else. And that distinction mattered. Because in a monarchy, authority is rarely contained inside a title. It can mean representing the crown at moments of national importance, becoming guardian of traditions, gaining access to private rooms and historic archives, or being entrusted with objects whose meaning reaches far beyond their material value. That was why the mood inside the meeting reportedly shifted. Not everyone was comfortable with how quickly the proposed transition was moving. Some believed the monarchy needed certainty before the announcement. Others feared that acting too soon would turn practical necessity into a private wound. A role could be reassigned in minutes. The emotional consequences might last for years. For Sophie, the danger was obvious. Accepting greater responsibility could strengthen the institution at a vulnerable moment, but it could also expose her to a brutal interpretation. That she had advanced because another royal had fallen away, stepped back, become estranged, or lost influence. What the palace might describe as service someone within the family could experience as replacement. Edward faced a quieter conflict. Duty told him that refusing the crown when it needed him would be almost unthinkable, but experience had taught him another truth. Royal responsibilities carry memories, rivalries, and expectations with them. Nothing is ever transferred without someone remembering who held it before. Then came the detail that changed the entire conversation. A restricted inventory was reportedly introduced, listing responsibilities and possessions connected to the expanded role. There were ceremonial items, historic objects, access privileges, and among them, one piece of jewelry that carried far more emotional weight than anyone expected. Its value was not simply measured in diamonds, age, or craftsmanship. It was bound to memory. To the woman who had worn it. To the person who believed it would one day pass to them. To a promise that may never have existed on paper, yet had somehow become real inside the family. The official announcement would say nothing about it. The public would hear words like continuity, service, responsibility, and duty. But those inside the royal circle would understand exactly what the transfer meant. And that, allegedly, was the moment Sophie hesitated. Not because she feared the responsibility itself, not because she doubted her ability to carry it, but because one object on that list threatened to turn duty into betrayal. Because tucked inside the institutional decision was something much more personal. A jewel whose ownership had never been as simple as the palace wanted the world to believe. Every monarchy has objects that are worth more emotionally than they could ever be financially. A brooch, necklace, tiara, or ring can carry promises no legal document records. And the jewel now connected to Sophie's emergency meeting was allegedly tied to one of those dangerous, unwritten royal understandings. Within this dramatized royal world, the jewel was not simply an ornament. It had become a quiet symbol of memory, rank, femininity, and belonging. It had been associated with important moments, private expectations, and a sense of continuity that stretched beyond any one wearer. To the public, it might appear to be just another historic piece from the royal collection. Inside the family, however, everyone understood that some objects carry invisible names. They may be controlled legally by the crown, yet emotionally claimed by a particular branch, a particular generation, or a particular woman who believed that one day the piece would pass naturally into her hands. That belief was where the danger began. According to the tension surrounding the meeting, an unwritten promise had existed for years. No signed document, no formal declaration, just an understanding repeated quietly enough to become accepted as fact. Someone had allegedly been led to believe that this jewel was meant for them, or at least reserved for their side of the family. And now, Sophie's expanded role threatened to destroy that assumption in a single decision. If she accepted the new responsibility, she could become the most logical person to wear it, safeguard it, or represent the crown through it. Publicly, the meaning would be simple: continuity. Stability, confidence, but privately, the message could be devastating. To wear the jewel would be to cross a boundary nobody had ever written down, yet everyone apparently knew existed. That was why Sophie's hesitation carried such weight. She could understand the institutional logic. Advisors reportedly favored the transfer precisely because the symbolism was so powerful. The monarchy needed reassurance, and few things communicate continuity more effectively than a familiar royal object placed into new hands. The audience would see elegance. The family might see displacement. Then came the objection. Before the meeting had fully settled, a message was allegedly relayed from within the family. It was not a legal warning. That would have been easier. Instead, it appealed to memory, loyalty, and a promise said to have been made in private. The argument was painfully simple. This was not just about who owned the jewel. It was about who had been told to expect it. Sophie reportedly asked the question no one else wanted to ask. Could the jewel be separated from the new responsibility? The answer was devastating. No, the object was part of the message. And with the palace announcement approaching, the timing began to look deliberate. Once the new arrangement became public, reversing it would be far more difficult. The institution would move first. The emotional consequences would follow. But the jewel was only the visible symbol of a much larger conflict. Because once the palace began deciding who could inherit royal responsibilities, another question became unavoidable. Who was being pushed aside? For one royal, Sophie and Edward's rise was not a reassuring story about continuity. It was proof that the monarchy had learned how to move on without them. And somewhere beyond that emergency meeting, a member of the family was allegedly realizing that influence can disappear long before a title does. That was the deeper wound hidden beneath the language of duty. Royal relevance is not protected by a name alone. It depends on presence, access, patronages, ceremonial responsibilities, private invitations, and the crown's willingness to place someone at the center of important moments. Once those privileges begin shifting elsewhere, the loss can become difficult to reverse. A role handed temporarily to Sophie and Edward might sound harmless at first, especially during a period of uncertainty. But temporary arrangements have a dangerous habit inside institutions like this. They settle. They become familiar. Then, almost without anyone admitting it, they become permanent. That was reportedly the fear haunting the royal or branch of the family now watching these changes unfold. The objection was not simply that Sophie and Edward were being trusted with more. It was that no one had formally agreed certain family associations, symbolic duties, heirlooms, or representational rights could be redistributed so easily. What the palace considered practical, someone else considered deeply personal. There was a sense that history itself was being rewritten in real time, not through a dramatic declaration, but through quiet decisions that would later be presented as inevitable. And Sophie was suddenly trapped at the center of that conflict. She had not created the instability. She had not demanded another person's place. Yet by accepting the palace's solution, she risked becoming the public face of someone else's loss. That is what made the situation so emotionally dangerous. Duty could look like ambition from the outside. Service could look like triumph. And loyalty to the crown could be interpreted inside the family as betrayal. Edward reportedly understood that danger almost immediately. During the discussion, he is said to have pushed for any change to be framed carefully, insisting that the new responsibilities should be presented as service, not replacement. The distinction sounded small, but emotionally it was enormous. He appeared to understand how humiliating it could feel for another royal to hear the institution publicly celebrate a transition that privately marked their decline. But advisors were wary. The monarchy needed clarity, soften the wording too much, and questions would multiply. Who actually held authority? Was the arrangement temporary? Could it be reversed? Was the family divided? Then came the problem no one inside the room wanted. The disagreement may already have escaped beyond the family's private circle. Someone outside the meeting apparently knew enough to understand exactly why Sophie and Edward's arrival mattered. That meant the palace might no longer control the timing, the interpretation, or even the next headline. And that possibility transformed the emergency gathering from a delicate family negotiation into something far more urgent, because the palace was suddenly racing not only against emotion, but against a leak. Royal announcements are designed down to the minute. Words are approved, relatives are informed, schedules are cleared, and symbolism is rehearsed. But on this day, somebody appeared to know too much too soon. And the moment Sophie and Edward were spotted, the palace's carefully protected timeline began unraveling in real time. What had started as a controlled internal decision was suddenly becoming something far more dangerous. Information about the meeting was reportedly beginning to circulate through unofficial channels, and no one inside the palace could be certain how much had escaped. A vague rumor was one thing. A detailed leak was another. The difference could determine whether the monarchy still controlled the story or was already reacting to it. The original plan had supposedly been simple: settle the matter privately, inform every person directly affected, and only then release the official announcement. That sequence mattered because royal communication depends on order. Nobody important is supposed to learn that their position has changed from a headline, a phone alert, or a whisper passed through someone else. But Sophie and Edward's arrival had disrupted that careful choreography. Their presence created questions before the palace had prepared answers. Inside the meeting, the pressure intensified. Advisors reportedly debated 3 options: bring the announcement forward and seize control, delay it and risk making the institution look uncertain, or release a bland holding statement designed to smother speculation without revealing anything meaningful. None of the choices was safe. Move early, and a member of the family might be blindsided. Wait too long, and the leak could define the story first. Then came the darker question: who had spoken? Was it a staff member who had seen too much? Someone attached to a household that felt threatened by the new arrangement? Or something more deliberate, a warning from a royal who believed they were being pushed aside and wanted to make sure the palace could not complete the transition quietly? For Sophie, that possibility made the entire situation more uncomfortable. If she accepted expanded responsibility while rumors were already spreading, duty could be made to look like ambition. A reluctant decision could be recast as a calculated advance. Edward reportedly cut through the discussion with one question: had every person directly affected been told? The silence that followed was more revealing than any answer. Someone important had not. At that moment, the communications problem became a family crisis. If the announcement went public first, one royal would effectively discover a life-changing decision alongside the rest of the world. And just as advisors began confronting that possibility, word came back that the untouched family member had already heard enough to know something was wrong, and was now demanding direct confirmation. With the announcement clock ticking and the family no longer safely contained, the meeting reached the moment everyone had been trying to avoid. Someone had to make the call. The most consequential moment of the emergency meeting did not happen in front of cameras or beneath palace chandeliers. It happened through a phone line. One conversation, kept away from the public, allegedly forced Sophie to confront what accepting the palace's plan would cost someone she could not simply dismiss as collateral damage. The call began with the kind of restraint expected inside royal circles. Polite words, controlled questions, no raised voices. But beneath that formality was something far more painful, the sense that trust had already been broken. The caller was not challenging the crown's authority to make decisions. They were asking why those decisions had apparently been made before they were consulted. Why had Sophie and Edward been summoned first? Why were responsibilities already being discussed while someone directly affected remained outside the room? Then the conversation turned to the jewel. The question was simple, but it carried years of meaning. Did Sophie intend to wear it? That was the moment the dispute stopped being about procedure. The jewel had become proof of something larger. To one side, it represented continuity. To the other, it represented displacement. Sophie reportedly refused to treat the question lightly. She did not speak of the piece as a prize nor as a reward for greater responsibility. Instead, she acknowledged the history attached to it, the memories, the expectations, and the invisible promises that had made its ownership so emotionally charged. That response mattered because it revealed the conflict at the heart of her position. Sophie could accept the institution's logic while still recognizing that duty does not erase pain. A decision can be constitutional, practical, even necessary, and still leave someone feeling betrayed. Edward reportedly pushed for a compromise. Let the wider transfer of duties proceed, but delay any public use of the jewel. Give the family time. Remove the most provocative symbol from the immediate announcement. The advisors were uneasy. Changing a detail under pressure could be interpreted as weakness. Worse, it could suggest that the palace had been forced to retreat because the family was divided. And then the caller revealed something no one in the room expected. They had known about the proposed changes before Sophie and Edward arrived. Suddenly, the leak was no longer a recent problem. It had started earlier, much earlier. That meant the palace may have lost control of the story before the emergency meeting even began. From that moment, the purpose of the gathering changed. It was no longer simply about approving a royal announcement. It was about preventing the private dispute from becoming the public narrative. And with the tension now impossible to ignore, the final document was placed before Sophie and Edward for approval. Now there was nothing left to negotiate except the words the public would hear, and the secrets those words were designed to conceal. When the announcement finally came, it sounded measured, dignified, almost ordinary, the language of duty, continuity, and service that the monarchy has perfected over generations. But those who understood what had happened inside the emergency meeting immediately noticed something strange. The statement carefully avoided the one detail everyone had fought over. There was no mention of urgency, no reference to the private disagreement, no hint that information had leaked before the palace was ready. The wording gave nothing away about contested responsibilities, emotional objections, or the inheritance question that had threatened to fracture the conversation behind closed doors. Instead, the message was calm. Controlled, Sophie and Edward would take on greater responsibilities, their place within the royal structure becoming more significant, more visible, and more difficult to dismiss as merely supportive. Publicly, it sounded like continuity. Privately, it represented something much deeper, a redistribution of trust. And yet the jewel was absent. Not one word, no explanation, no confirmation of who would wear it, safeguard it, or claim its symbolic meaning. After everything that had allegedly been argued over, that silence became impossible to ignore. Sophie did not immediately appear wearing it either, suggesting that some form of compromise may have survived the meeting. But that did not mean the wider decision had been reversed. The responsibilities remained. The shift in influence remained. Whatever happened to the jewel, another branch of the family had already lost ground. For Sophie, the victory was therefore complicated. Greater status also meant inheriting resentment she had not created. She had become more useful to the monarchy and, perhaps for that very reason, more threatening to those who feared being replaced. Edward faced the same paradox. A man known for quiet duty now carried responsibilities capable of changing his family's position for years to come. Then came the final disturbing possibility. What if the emergency meeting had never been only about this announcement? The additional papers, the expectation of another attendee, the unresolved questions surrounding property, access, and ceremonial rights, the suggestion that a second announcement had been discussed before the first was even released. Taken together, those details pointed toward something larger, a broader restructuring still being kept behind the palace walls. That would explain the secrecy. It would explain the urgency. And it would explain why the official statement sounded so calm. Because monarchy survives by making dramatic internal change appear effortless. The absence of chaos in public does not mean chaos never existed. In this story, the polished announcement was evidence of how much had already been settled before the public was allowed to hear a single word. And if Sophie and Edward's new position was only the first move, one question now hangs over everything. Whose role is about to change next? And that is why Sophie and Edward's quiet arrival may ultimately matter more than the announcement itself. Because royal history is rarely transformed when the cameras are watching, it changes behind closed doors, and only afterward does the palace decide what the world is permitted to know.